Okay, now for the second part of chapter 16, looking at interactions of multiple species. And so in a community, multiple species interact, generating multiple connections. And there's direct species interactions that occur, between two species, competition, predation, facilitation, etc. And there's indirect interactions, relationships between two species are mediated by a third or more species. And they're often harder to get at because you're looking at how a third party changes the interaction between two species that might not even be interacting with one another or having kind of small interactions. The example the book gave is like, when you and your friend hang out all the time, and then your friend invites a new friend over, and then they wind up going off and hanging out all the time. And now you and your former friend never see each other. Kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, but generally the same sort of thing where your interaction with your friend is indirectly impacted by the third party. So in this example, you could have species A that perhaps interacts with species B, or is interacting directly with species B. The solid lines in this case indicate direct interaction, and the dashed lines imply indirect interaction. So species A is directly interacting with species B, which is directly interacting with species C, and that's somehow altering the dynamics between species A and B. It could be positive or negative, it depends on the situation, but the presence of C has changed this interaction between A and B. And we'll walk through a couple specific examples. One thought of this is our trophic cascades, where the rate of consumption at one trophic level results in a change in species abundance or composition at a lower level, i.e. a carnivore eats an herbivore, a direct negative effect on the herbivore, not good. The decrease in the herbivore abundance has a positive effect on the primary producer. Using our simplified kelp example here, the addition of the carnivore, the sea otter, eating the herbivore, the sea urchin, is bad for the sea urchin. Removal of the sea urchin is then good for kelp, resulting in more kelp growth. So therefore the presence of otters has an indirect positive benefit for the kelp. The otters are not directly interacting with the kelp, but they're indirectly interacting with the kelp by removing its primary predator. And so then kelp can go on and do all of its great things, grow quickly, fix a lot of carbon, serve as habitat or food for other invertebrates or fishes. So in this way, it's a trophic cascade that the addition of a top predator then results in increased primary productivity and increased additional resources for other members of that community. You could also think of this in like many of our terrestrial systems, or our herbivores are overpopulated. Black-tailed deer being an example of that, where removal of black-tailed deer would then have a positive benefit for many of our native plants, native endangered butterflies, and songbirds as well. So they're all negatively impacted by the overgrazing of their habitat by black-tailed deer. If those black-tailed deer were removed by a predator, it would then have benefit for those, endangered butterflies, for example. Trophic facilitation, a consumer is indirectly facilitated by a positive interaction between its prey and another species. Now this is kind of a complicated one, and I read it a couple times, and I actually pulled the original paper, and then it made sense. I think they left out a key component of the story in the book, and I went back and reread it. I was like, man, did I just miss it? And maybe I did, but there's a key piece missing from the book that was clarified in the original manuscript. Now, the paper's by Sally Hacker, who's one of the authors of the book, and so, it's one of her more famous papers, so obviously she knows it well. And maybe I missed it, maybe it got edited out, or maybe it's one of those things where you just know the story so well that, I don't know. Or maybe I'm mistaken, but anyway, I'll walk through the story as I understand it. So again, trophic facilitation, a consumer is indirectly facilitated by a positive interaction between its prey and another species. And we can look at the interactions between salt marsh plants that affect aphids. So consumer is indirectly facilitated by a positive interaction between its prey and another species. Okay, so here our consumer is going to be the aphid, our prey is going to be the ava, and the other species is going to be the, what's the name of the rush? Or the sedge, Juncus, of course, yeah. Okay, so aphid, ava, Juncus is a piece that's missing here. So in this idea, Iva, Iva, the shrub, needs Juncus to survive in the salt marsh. So Juncus does a few things about shading, adding oxygen to the soil that allows Iva to grow. In the absence of Juncus, there's no Iva growth. But the Iva that's growing, because this is actually on the lower end of their distribution, so the Iva that are growing in this habitat are actually a lot shorter than normal Ivas, and they kind of hide under the Juncus. And so it's primarily like a meadow of Juncus, and then there's small Ivas below that. So they're smaller, they call it even a dwarf type, and they're kind of hidden by the Juncus. But because the Juncus allows the shrub Iva to exist, it's good for the aphids. So the aphids like Iva, but they don't like Juncus. And so when the aphids can find the Iva, they're happy. The Juncus is indirectly facilitating the aphid, because if the Juncus didn't exist, then the aphid wouldn't have something to eat the Iva. So the Juncus and the sedge Juncus and the shrub Iva have a commensal relationship. So the Juncus shades the soil surface, decreasing evaporation and salt buildup, and Juncus also has a tissue that allows oxygen to move into the roots, and some oxygen goes in the soil where other plants can use it. So the experimental removal of Juncus decreased the growth rate of Iva, but removing Iva had no effect on Juncus. So it's a commensal relationship. Iva's getting benefit from Juncus. You can't survive without Juncus, but then when Iva's removed, there's no benefit to Juncus. Juncus doesn't care about Iva. So it's a +0 relationship. The population growth rates of aphids on Iva were significantly higher when Juncus was present, and so Juncus has an indirect positive effects on the aphids. Let me see if this goes into the next. We'll look at these graphs here. What is missing from the story is so this kind of population growth rates of aphids on Iva were significantly higher when Juncus was present. Okay, that makes sense, because if there's no Iva, there's no nothing for the aphids to eat. But the other part of this, I'm trying to think if it's better in the next slide or not. But the other piece that's missing from this explanation is that the Iva that grow under Juncus in this environment are smaller. And so again, imagine a sea of Juncus and little Ivas all around it. Aphids like the Ivas, but what aphids don't like are ladybugs, or they call it a ladybird beetle in the original paper. And if you have IVA growing on the higher tide line where it can grow on its own, it grows really tall. Aphids come and land on the IVA, but so does the ladybird beetle, aka ladybug, and it just devours the aphids. And so in its like kind of more preferred habitat higher on the tide line, where it's not as salty, the ladybird beetles or ladybugs mow down all of the aphids. And so here, because the IVA is hidden under the juncus, it's harder for the aphids to find, but when they find it, they grow really well because juncus is also hiding the presence of the aphids, and so the ladybugs don't see the aphids. So it creates this little refuge where they've got IVA that they like eating if they can find it, and they don't have their predator that comes by and kills them all. And I think that's a piece that's missing from the book that helps explain these next graphs, which are actually taken directly out of the original 1996 paper with Hacker. And Mark Britness is a famous ecologist at Brown University who studies salt marshes, and he's famous for like looking at positive impacts. So here we've got the photosynthetic rate of IVA with and without juncus. And so with juncus it's higher, without juncus it's lower throughout the year. The population growth rate of aphids with juncus and without juncus. And so here's a big difference where with juncus the population growth rate R is greater than 0. So the intrinsic rate of growth is greater than 0, meaning it's growing in the blue bars with juncus. Without juncus, slight growth, almost no growth, and then negative growth in August, indicating eventually the population will go locally extinct. Here's a log of the number of aphids and then time. And the predicted growth here is with juncus to keep increasing aphids, and then without juncus eventually go locally extinct. So the aphids eat IVA, they don't eat juncus, but juncus is giving IVA a place to live and hiding the aphids from their main predator, the evil ladybug. And so what's really happening here is juncus is actually providing two benefits to the aphids. One is it's giving IVA a place to live, but then if we remove the juncus, then the IVA is exposed and ladybugs see it, land there looking for tasty morsels of aphids, and then wind up mowing down all of the aphids. So it's a pretty interesting interaction here. And juncus is doing all this and presumably doesn't really care because the aphids don't eat juncus. But they do eat IVA. IVA is only growing in conjunction with juncus because juncus is providing the habitat facilitation, and it turns out it's shading or hiding the aphids from ladybugs. So it's kind of an interesting story. So juncus had positive and negative effects on IVA. Improves soil conditions, but it facilitates the aphids, which are eating IVA, so having a negative impact. But since IVA can't survive indefinitely without juncus, the positive effects outweigh the negative. And again, this is also in kind of the lower end of the IVA distributions, but it's pretty interesting, and like adding that extra layer about the ladybug is pretty important. And so we could think about, I'm just thinking about how to analyze this. So if we had a system with juncus and IVA, and you artificially added ladybugs, how would that impact the aphid population? Maybe it'd be one way of thinking about it. And then in this instance, if you had, it's not quite because we don't really know what the overall, it's not quite a trophic cascade of like thinking about it as like ladybug, aphid, Iva because aphids are eating Iva, but in here it hasn't really given any indication that they're mowing them down to like low levels to really impacting the photosynthetic capability of it. But if we said like what are three, let me see, is it three positive impacts? That might not be right, but how Juncus is both a negative and a positive, or how Juncus, two ways that Juncus are positively impacting aphids, right? So Juncus are positively impacting aphids. There are two ways Juncus is indirectly positively interacting with aphids. So one, it's providing, it's facilitating the growth of Iva, which aphids like, and it's also hiding Iva and the aphids from ladybugs, which they don't like. So Juncus is providing two indirect benefits to aphids, providing a home for the things they like to eat and hiding them from the things that like to eat them. So that's probably a good one to think about, of explaining two ways that Juncus positive or indirectly has a positive indirect interaction with aphids. Two ways Juncus has a positive indirect interaction with aphids, providing a home for Iva and shielding them from ladybugs. I like that one. I'll come back to that one. This is Bustin' Jackson. This is Jeremy Jackson, who's now better known for his shifting baselines work, but at his core is a bryozoan and sponge researcher. So they hypothesized that these competitive networks would allow the coexistence of competitors and thus maintain species richness. And they came up with this competitive network idea that interactions among multiple species in which every species has a negative effect on every other species and no one species dominates the interaction, allowing for coexistence. This is the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of hypothesis. So in a competitive network, A will outcompete B, but B will outcompete C, and C will outcompete A. So A has a negative impact on B, and then negative impact on B. B is having a indirect positive impact on A. So let's just walk through A and B here. So if there's a bunch of A, they're hammering on B, or they're outcompeting B, which is not good. But if there's a bunch of A, they are outcompeting C, which is the main competitor for A, and so that's good for A. And then kind of all the way around. So if there's a lot of C, they're consuming or they're outcompeting a lot of A, which is an indirect benefit for B, because if there's a lot of A, then they're impacting B, or they're outcompeting B. And so you can kind of play this game where you go around of like, whoever is on top, if C is doing quite well, they're really hammering on A, which means that B is no longer under pressure from A, so B can rise in population and then go after C. Now B's on top, and now A is going after B, which is reducing B, which is having a positive impact for C, so C can start to rise in population. So you can kind of go around the circle one after one after one. And this creates this competitive network that is kind of self-stabilizing. Or you can have a competitive hierarchy where B is a better competitor than A, and then C is a better competitor than B. And so to test the competitive network hypothesis, algae and invertebrate species compete for space on coral reefs by overgrowing one another. Effectively, it's a war for space. So you have different types of algae or bryozoans or sponges all fighting for space. And if one was the most dominant, then they would just dominate everywhere. But yet we have all of these different species underneath coral reefs overgrowing one another in this constant battle for space. And so how does this work? And so what Buss and Jackson did is they kind of took pictures and noted where these different encrusting algae, or like I said, a lot of bryozoans and sponges were, and then followed them over time and saw that the same sort of scenario of playing out where the species A can outcompete B. They would do that, but B was fighting with C, and so now C can come over and start growing over A, which releases B, and so they'll go over C, and they're just kind of going around in a circle in this way. So it's pretty interesting work, and it's like interesting because it's on this like small scale of underneath the coral reef. So we can also look at interaction strength, which is the magnitude of the effect of one species on the abundance of another. This can be measured by removing one species, the interactor species, from the community and observing the effect on the other species, the target species. So meaning if we're looking at these interactions, how strong are they? When you remove the one doing the interaction, the interactor on the target, what happens to the target? Does it go up or down, and by how much? If removal of the interactor results in a large decrease in the target species, then the interactor has a strong positive effect on the target species. If removal of the interactor causes an increase in the target species, then the interactor has a strong negative impact on the target species. Okay, that sounds a bit backwards, but it makes sense. Let's walk through it again. So if you remove the interactor, results in a decrease in the target species, then the interactor has a positive effect on the target species. So in the Juncus Iva example, if you remove Juncus, then Iva also goes down. Therefore, Juncus has a strong positive effect on Iva. Juncus has a positive impact on Iva. So if we remove Juncus, Iva populations go down. If we remove, let's look at the negative interactions. If we remove the interactor and it causes an increase in the target species, the interactor has a strong negative effect on the target species. If you remove urchins, kelp goes up. So in that case, if you remove the indicator, if you remove if removal on the interactor causes an increase in the target species. So if we remove urchins, kelp goes up, then urchins have a negative effect on kelp. It sounds a bit different because it's like, if there's an increase, then it's negative. If there's a decrease, it's positive. But, think of like the opposite of it. So if we added urchins, then kelp will go down, so therefore it has a negative impact. I'm not going to stress too much about the per capita interaction strength, but we can just look at it quickly. C is the number of target individuals with the interactor present. E is the number of target individuals with the interactor absent, and I is the number of interactor individuals. So all this is saying is this is a ratio of looking at the number of individuals, of the target individuals with the interactor present, and the number with the target individuals with the interactor absent. So in the urchin kelp example, this would be the number of kelp with urchins present divided by the number of kelp with urchins missing. So in this case, this would be a smaller number, and this would be a larger number. The number of interactor individuals, number of urchins, and this gives us an idea of the strength, gives you an idea of the relative proportion of the strength of that interactor. And so it's worth like itemizing and thinking about that way. And you could imagine a couple scenarios where the ratio of C to E being above 1 or below 1 would matter, and then the number of interactors. Now these interactions are place specific often, and so and we'll delve later into the famous Piesaster sea star keystone species, Bob Payne throwing sea stars out at Tatoosh a bit later, but whenever you come up with a big famous paper, and that was somewhere between 1969 and 1971. This is Menge's work. Bruce Menge is a faculty at OSU, was a Payne student as well, so kind of came out of that school. And he was asking, well, is it always this, are sea stars always such a strong interactor that they're defined as a keystone species, where when you have sea stars, they eat the mussels and keep the space open and increase biodiversity? Or is it only the case in certain areas? And so here he did a bunch of classic intertidal ecology things where he excludes sea stars by gluing down these little cages on rocky heads and then more protected bays, and found that in exposed areas the removal of sea stars didn't have that much impact on the intertidal ecosystem. There's still mussels were not the most dominant organism there. There's still a pretty good diversity. But in protected areas, sea stars are a stronger interactor. So in this case, if sea stars are eating up, in this case, in a sheltered area, having sea stars will keep mussels at bay and keep the system more diverse. In exposed areas, it didn't seem to matter as much. And so there's that the role of Piesaster as an efficient predator is reduced in these really wavy systems where there's lots of waves crashing, so they can be dislodged, things like that. So they'll be foraging in different areas, and so their relative importance is dependent on the environment. So a foundational species, they have large effects on other species and thus species diversity by virtue of their considerable abundance or biomass. Trees are kind of like the poster child here of a foundational species. And so we can think about this, this is kind of like a Stommel diagram, but not quite, but I like it. So you can think of a small relative size and abundance of the species, so small number of otters having a large impact on the ecosystem, a small finch or other songbirds, less of an impact. Trees need to be large. You need to have a lot of trees, and then you have a large impact, overall impact on species. And so having a single tree out in a field might not matter, but having a forest will then change the species distribution there, because they're a foundational species. They change the shape and nature of the ecosystem. Think about a field compared to a forest. Some foundation species are ecosystem engineers. They create or modify or maintain the physical habitat for themselves and other species. Trees are an example of that. Coral reefs are an example of that. Kelp forests are an example. Corals are like literally building an ecosystem. So it's a number of examples of that. And so if we look at, what does a tree do as acting as an ecosystem engineer, they provide habitat for other species within them, within leaves, branches, trunk. Think about all the insects, fungus, squirrels, whatever growing in there. They change the physical environment by altering the temperature. It's cooler, it's less windy, there's less rain under a tree. When they die, they provide nursery logs. You think about all the insects, salamanders, mushrooms, things growing on dead logs. The roots aerate the soil and help hold and stabilize the soil together, as well as they're fixing a lot of carbon that they're exporting to, which all ultimately gets consumed in one way or another. So they do quite a lot. And again, like you have to think of like forest versus plain. Like what's the difference there? And keystone species are called. They have a strong effect. They have a strong effect because of their role in defining the community. This effect is large in proportion to their biomass and abundance. They usually influence community structure indirectly via trophic means. In the case of sea otters, a sea otter can be thought of as the keystone species. If you have otters that keep urchins in check, you have a big healthy kelp forest. It doesn't take that many otters to really keep the urchins in check, and compared to the extent and biomass of a large, luscious kelp forest, they're relatively small. So it's a relatively small piece of the puzzle, but it has this massive impact on the ecosystem. Beavers are also an interesting way of thinking about an ecosystem engineer. Beaver dams dramatically change the hydrology and nature of kind of swampy, lakey ecosystems. We used to have a massive number of beavers, and through the kind of early fur trade, and then even the fur industry was really rocking through the 70s, and it's I've heard a bunch of stories about people in high school that started trapping at 13, 14 in the Midwest, Minnesota somewhere, and by the time they turned 16 bought a brand new truck, ordered a brand new truck with their profits from beaver pelts. They would make, the kids could be making more than their parents by trapping. That the fur boom sort of fell apart, I think, in the 70s. We often think of the fur trading as early European exploits in the New World associated with fur. But it really persisted for a long time, particularly for beavers. But I think it was in the 70s, maybe 80s, but I think the late 70s, the prices dropped. I don't know why. Global demand for fur went down, I guess. But since then, we've seen an increase in beavers in lots of areas. And here's an example from Minnesota showing this network of wetlands that have changed from 1940 to 1986. You'd actually expect the opposite trend to happen. Generally, wetlands are decreasing. Generally, wetlands are decreasing as we have development, etc. But here's an example of wetlands increasing, driven by these massive ecosystem engineers. I was going to say otters. I got otters in my beavers, by creating these giant beaver dams, raising the water level, really altering the ecosystem. So, really, for they have a den of beavers here, maybe 3 or 4, but they're changing acres and acres and acres of the landscape via both the consumption and removal of trees, but then also the building of these dams. It's really pretty interesting how much they can do. And some species are not beavers. You heard it here first. So they might only play a small role in community structure and function, but they contribute to the overall diversity, and their presence or absence could have little significance in the ultimate regulation of the communities. And some of these are redundant, having the same function as other species within a larger functional group. So if we had a mythical, in California, a good example of that are large lobsters and sheephead, which is a wrasse fish. Both consume urchins. Now, there were sea otters throughout California, and there still are some, obviously, as well. But this ecosystem I'm talking about occurs mostly in Southern California. It goes up through, are they in Monterey? They're probably in Monterey. I'm trying to think if they're north or south of Point Conception. But we'll talk about Southern California, La Jolla. You've got kelp forest and urchins the two main urchin predators are giant spiny lobsters that love eating urchins and big giant male sheephead that love eating urchins. So in that case, in the ecosystem, they're redundant. You can lose one and you still maintain the control of urchins, but if you lose both of them, then urchins can take over and decimate the kelp forests, which is what we're seeing. And for both of those species, it's more than just them existing. They have to be big giant ones. And so their sheephead are a sequential hermaphrodite, where they start off as a female, then they turn to male when they're the biggest one, sort of in the flock, if you will, or school. And so as fishing pressure removes the larger ones, then the ones that used to be middles are now large, and so they're metamorphosing into males, and so you have to be a certain size to eat the urchins. Same thing for lobsters, that the lobster fishery, much like our Dungeness crab fishery, effectively removes every legal individual from the population every year. And illegal lobster is not that big; they're like a pound. But the urchin eaters, the big ones, the 6 to 10 pound lobsters, can really do a number on urchins, and those are very, very rare. Many of those are too big to fit in the traps, but they're still being caught by sport divers or hoop netters, which is really similar to the crab rings we have up here, where you basically lay down. It's like 2 hula hoops with mesh in it. You lay it down and put like a fish head in there, and then the lobsters crawl in, and you lift the thing up. So that redundant functional group is being impacted. So that's one example of a redundant species. And the species interaction can be context dependent. Again, like looking at the sea stars in relation to flow, whether or not they're functioning as the keystone species. This one's sort of interesting, looking at the armored larvae of caddisflies, and during winter floods, they scour armored herbivores, insects from the stream, which results in blooms of the algae. Cladophoria in the spring. The midge flies feed on cladophoria, which are in turn fed on by small predators, which are thin and in turn fed on by steelhead and this roach. So fish predators decrease the size of algal mats indirectly by eating the small predators. So these steelhead, for example, is eating the small predator, so it's driving down the population of small predators. So they're not available to eat the midges, and so the cladophoria populations can grow rapidly. So here we'd have, let's think about this. So if this is our kelp, this is our urchins, this is our, it doesn't quite work because they would be eating. Okay, sorry, I got this backwards here for a second. Decrease the size by eating the small predators. Yeah, the midges go crazy and they eat it. I might have said that backwards initially. I'm sorry. Okay, so you have steelhead, lots of steelhead. They're eating lots of the small predators, which is releasing the midges from predation. So the midges are then eating the cladophoria algae, keeping the algae in check. Or during non-flood years, all of the caddisfly larvae, which we have around here, they're kind of crazy. They have like small pebbles glued together, and so you can imagine crawling around on a rock with a bunch of pebbles glued to you. It's very easy for you to get blown down the stream, which can happen during a flood. Some of them obviously survive, but many of them get pushed down. During a drought year, a flood control year, an area with not a lot of flow, a lot of these caddisflies make it through the winter, and they come out in the spring and start chewing down on the algae, which leaves less resources for the midges, small predators, steelheads, and the roach here as well. So the nature of this interaction really depends on flooding, and whether or not the caddisflies kind of take over and consume all the algae, or with the caddisflies are a minor role, and the midges can consume a lot of the algae, then also transferring food up to these higher trophic levels. And so there's a couple ways to think about this. One is like it changes the role of steelhead in being a keystone species, but it also changes the carbon distribution of whether it goes into caddisflies or whether it goes into tertiary consumers. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop it there, and that should wrap up chapter 16.